Awesome. All right, what's up, y'all? So now I'm going to continue on with Lazzarato, probably finishing it up in this video here, or this episode. And I'll be starting from chapter 4, so about midway through the book, where he continues his, what he calls his critique of governmentality. So at this point, Lazzarato really shifts his focus onto this idea of subjectivity and how subjectivity comes about, at least for him, in accordance with the development of finance capital. So to sort of recap, what we have is like commodity capital or industrial capital or industrialization as being one form that capital can assume. And then financial capital is that what I will currently say is the form that follows it, but it's also intertwined with it, where finance capital and industrial capital are always already part of the same system, but overtly one only manifests itself at a given time. So he's very interested in how finance capital fosters this idea of subjectivity. So some of the ways that we can begin to understand this sort of preliminarily is by how people are given, I guess, choice, or we could think of the paradox of choice, and how that fosters an illusory form of subjectivity that is indicative of the culture industry or advanced industrial capitalism. Now, I'm going to be hard on Lazzarato here because in order to level his critique, he takes aim at Foucault, and I am much more in line with what Foucault says than what Lazzarato says. With that being said, there are other things that I'm going to take Lazzarato to task for because he makes some rather odd claims, especially about Deleuze and Guattari, and about the development of subjectivity more generally. Notably, and just to preface it, I find he's reductive about the ways that what he calls axiomatics of capital or axiomatics of financial capital, how they come about. So it seems as though he wants to reduce everything, and this is indicative of Marxist thought generally, reduce everything to capital. So like how identity only comes about through capital, which disavows the ways in which these forms of identities or identity in general has manifested themselves pre-capital, or even how they will manifest themselves post-capital, if that's even possible. So he begins this chapter 4, by saying that in the birth of biopolitics, Foucault introduces a distinction between capital and capitalism, which must hold our attention, for he presents at once a critique of Marxism and a new definition of capitalism. So moreover, Lazzarato identifies that Foucault reproaches Marx and Marxists for identifying capitalism with the economic logic of capital and its accumulation. So what he's saying is that Foucault recognizes a sort of heterogeneity of capital, and that it's all too simple to reduce it to, as Lazzarato quotes Foucault saying, the economic logic of capital and its accumulation. So the other forms that it can take, although perhaps relying on this same accumulation, has a very different relationship, not only to the people within it, but to that very mode of, I guess, capitalist accumulation. So specifically, again in Lazzarato quoting Foucault, he says that the economic process and institutional framework call on each other, support each other, modify and shape each other in ceaseless reciprocity. So there is a sort of Mobius strip of designation, or it constitutes or resembles something like a Mobius strip between capitalism and capital, or the accumulation of capital, where the two inform one another, and it's not simply as though, as we might have it in the classical Marxist understanding of the base and the superstructure, where one directly informs the other. And I don't think Lazzarato is saying that Foucault is totally wrong about this either, so he hasn't really begun his critique yet. Because, as Lazzarato says quite specifically, we can therefore agree with Foucault that capitalism is not directly deducible from capital, as Marx described it. In spite of this, Lazzarato, and this is where the critique comes in, claims that there is a guiding thread through capitalism. Notably, it is the guiding thread of the contradictions and impasses that capital assumes, or that capital sort of imposes, not so much capital itself or the accumulation of capital, but rather its contradictions. So I think he's taking really from, he doesn't quote the Grundrisse here, but it seems very much like along those lines, and starting to be much more in tune with Deleuze and Guattari's thesis in Anti-Oedipus, notably that the argument around schizophrenia and capitalism. So it's difficult, however, to understand how Lazzarato communicates or transposes this idea, this notion of the contradictions and impasses, onto the history of capital and capitalism. Because then he goes on to say, just following this moment, that finance capital, notably the thing responsible for the 2008 crisis, is part and parcel of that very system. So it would appear as though Lazzarato is a little bit more reticent to assume the same in the previous form that capital sort of assumed, in the industrial mode, and is now more prepared because of the hyperreal speed in which we find ourselves, or in which this financial capital sort of surrounds us. Because of that, and the varying flows and decoding that is going on, then we find ourselves in a kind of hyperreal example of these contradictions and impasses, giving at least I think he's assuming that we'll understand in him that he is providing us with the tools to just challenge this system, the current form of capitalism, as opposed to the old one per se. So what we see in this age, notably in the advent of finance capital, is a liberation of capital, or in finance capitalism, we see a liberation of capital. So what Lazzarato says about this is that freeing capital does not mean freeing its supposed self-regulatory power, the market, but rather its imminent movement of permanent disequilibrium, its systematic search for asymmetries and inequalities, the conditions of its valorization, in other words, of the appropriation and expropriation of social production that are its actual aims. So we see a sort of explosion here, right? And this does share many affinities with Foucault's project in like the history of sexuality, where there was an explosion of discourse around sexuality and how that doesn't necessarily constitute an emancipation. Lazzarato is saying, I guess in part, a very similar thing with regards to capital, and the way that capital allows for expression, allows for a sort of freedom, but it is a freedom that is always already constrained by the limits of that very system. So what we see, and this is kind of and it was Ford's move in a sense, but we're also thinking about the post-Fordist era, indoctrinating people into that very system. So it became a totalizing system in that way. It was deterritorialized, at least that's how Lazzarato uses the term. But what we saw were people being indoctrinated into this system in different ways. So we can think of the culture industry in this way via Adorno, who would, Lazzarato, oddly enough, doesn't quote Adorno directly in this book, at least I'm not aware. But it is really speaking to the Adornian principle, or the idea that, we are all subsumed under this this oppressive culture industry, where no matter what people do, whatever kind of political resistance they mount, will always be fed back into that very system. So what might be perceived as some of the most radical or more radical approaches to overthrowing the system, if I can use such a vulgar term, trying to mobilize a sort of deterritorialization of oneself, that is going to different places or whatever, would not, I don't think, fall under the rubric of really effective political resistance for Lazzarato, because it would match the deterritorializing force of the system itself, that really just takes people, or sees no limits, and then can therefore subsume anyone and everyone under the same kind of homogenizing structure. But it is a structure that is it's riddled with contradictions. It's a structure that is not, as Baudrillard might say, really a move towards a general law of equivalence or a code, but rather, as Lazzarato says, to a decoding, a deregulation. So in this way, and Lazzarato makes it extremely clear, and again, to reiterate what had gone on in the first episode here, talking about the transition from a finite and mobile mode of debt to an infinite mode of debt. So Lazzarato's thinking about that in terms of Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals, and how capitalism introduces sort of infinite debt that can never really be repaid. Hence, it subsumes people in a perpetual mode of oppression. So for him, as he states here, capital thus has no external limit aside from its own valorization, which means that, and this is something absolutely new, capitalism is also the first society to introduce the infinite into the economy and production. And then he continues by saying that the infinite can never attain equilibrium. The infinite is what will always house a sort of indeterminate mode of possibilities or deterritorialized flows, and he takes that to be a negative thing, that is always already an oppressive mechanism, because it sees no limits, and then you can have sweatshops and globalization and all that type of stuff. But this is one of the trickier things I have with this text, is because he presents the threat of authoritarian governments or reactionary type politics coming out of this as a sort of strategy to reclaim, an equilibrium. But it would seem as though that what he's describing in the corporatization of, or the privatization of all elements of life, would actually move towards a sort of equilibrium where there would be, through that, almost a total homogenization, eventually to the point of there being virtually no escape and very little mobility. So I understand what he's saying when he's talking about equilibrium, and I'm on board to some extent, but I think we should also consider the more subtle ways that it moves towards equilibrium, an oppressive form of equilibrium that crystallizes identity, that crystallizes people, that grounds them, solidifies them, and in doing so effectively closes off all possibility of mobility. But we'll keep going on here. So he makes then an interesting claim regarding the indifference of capital in this financial capitalism, where he says that financing flows establish and impose differences, asymmetries, and inequalities among material flows. He goes on, functional relations are also, and above all, relations of power. For if money is indifferent to the content of production and labor, it is not indifferent to power relations. So this is an interesting concept, because, for my own part, because it sees something of, a give and take between the system of power relations, which seems to be, at least in how he's framing it here, to have some elements of itself that is separate from capital. Because then why would he even bother qualifying or stating this, saying that one is not not indifferent to the other. So there is something of a separation here, and this is, I think, he's being consistent coming out of his discussion of Schmidt, and there being that sort of political foundation to the movement of the economic sphere, and how these two things, influence one another, but are in a sense separate. But the fact that he makes clear that capital is not necessarily free from these power relations is certainly an interesting point, and it does begin to open up, the political side of his argument, where it's not a total loss of hope, right? But that there are clearly people that are affected, and perhaps by evaluating the way in which people are affected via the market, and we can think of the wage gap as just one example, then we can understand what is going on in those other spheres that aren't necessarily a result of capital, but that work with it in a sense. So it's almost like trying to understand by evaluating capital as he describes it here. It's almost like trying to understand the world by reading literature or reading these impossible scenarios in order to understand who we are, for example, as just one possibility to grasp some of the consequences. But again, and this is a point that he comes back to repeatedly, we would do well not to see this form of capitalism as being inherently separate from industrial capitalism or how it manifests itself earlier. Rather, this form of capital is, in a sense, what he comes to say to be the conclusion or the end point of industrial capital, where at one time, of course, capital was, or profit was earned for the sake of earning profit. And we can get this from Marx, right, in the Grundrisse or Capital, where whatever profits are taken, are earned, are put back into the machine, and then so that those profits can grow, right? For what point, who knows? But that is what occurs. Now, for Lazzarato and how he identifies it with financial capital, there is a bit of a shift where this extra capital earned is, placed in offshore banks, it's put in tax havens or whatever, and it does nothing. It sits idle. So it is that extreme form of capital being used simply for the sake of it being capital that we see it manifest itself today. So again, I reiterate, in that sense, it's not so much that it is different from the old form, but that it is certainly at the very least an extension of it, if not the conclusion. But where the difference really lies between these two forms is in how he thinks about axiomatics. So as he says, all societies once solved the problem of decodification that money introduced by establishing extra economic codes, whether religious, social, or political, when money is the only code. So we're thinking of it here in terms of money for the sake of money, or its valorization. When money is the only code compatible with capital, how can flows be controlled? How can their conjunction and appropriation be regulated? So what he's proposing is that in the old framework with when they were presented with the threat of things being decoded, they had these axiomatics that played the role of limiting that possibility. Or as he says, axiomatics allows us to answer the questions raised by the deterritorialization, abstraction of social relations. So in this day and age, we retain the idea of axiomatics in some form or other, but even that idea that was once reserved for the religious, the political, or the social, as he claimed happened in the pre-finance capital age, what we are seeing now are kind of strategies or illusions of these axiomatics. So as he says, on the other hand, in order to be realized concretely, axiomatics must necessarily produce and reproduce the same qualifications that money, the great equalizer, erases by establishing not only class but also racial, gender, and social divisions and hierarchies. So, and this is where, I really disagree, where these things apparently only come about as a result or through the will of capital, but we'll put that aside for now. But he goes on to call these axiomatics compensatory territorializations. And this is when it manifests itself in the most extreme forms, and we could think of the reactionary kind of ultra-conservative politics that are floating around all over the world, or coming up all over the world. He suggests that the rhetoric that suggests we return to the nation state is an attempt, albeit an impossible attempt or an attempt that will inevitably fail, an attempt to reclaim a sort of grounding, reclaim roots that this financial capital system has eradicated in favor of, endless deterritorialization. So what he says is that the nation state here becomes the model of realization of the axiomatics of capital insofar as it assures the passional and living forms in which qualitative homogeneity and the quantitative completion of abstract capital are first realized. Oh, oops, sorry, that was a quote. That was out of Deleuze and Guattari, but the point, is retained. And then in Lazzarato's words, as he follows up, the flows of subjectivities freed from prior social codifications must be formatted by state institutions, schools, armies, hospitals, healthcare, which assign to individual subjects a body, a gender, a race, a nationality, and a subjectivity that functions within the social division of labor. And this is where he sees some use to Foucault in describing the, the disciplinary effects of these institutions. And it is from this explosion of disciplinary mechanisms, or the carceral state, if we were to take one of Foucault's terms, that we see that development of a sort of subjectivity at the same time of a subjection. Like you are being subjected to your own subjectivity, in a sense. So I wonder, and I'll just throw this question out there for anyone who is listening or who listens to this, I would wonder what is necessarily worse. Like, it's just a curious thought experiment, where at one time under industrial capital, where there was the clear, division between producer and laborer, or owner of the means of production and laborer, and the sort of oppressive things that came about as a result of that, and the one we find ourselves in today, where this explosion of, possibility in a sense marks an oppressive framework. I would wonder which is worse. And I'm not trying to lean one way or the other, but I don't think the answer is necessarily obvious. And for that reason, Lazzarato sort of assumes that if he describes all these mechanisms coming about today in relation to Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault, then it'll just be obvious to us, the reader, that these things represent something fundamentally worse, or at least something to really be weary of. But I don't think it's quite so simple, and I'd be curious what anyone else has to say about it. So he turns his attention here to think about, the image of this sort of finance capital as a machine, where that's something for him that's a little bit, is an odd suggestion, because for him a machine is that thing that only kind of performs one function, right? Whereas this system is something that adapts and changes, and there's like tentacles, gets into anywhere. So in that way, for him, it's a social machine, because it mimics that of the body in a sense, where we think via Aristotle, man is a social animal. So we're making a little bit of a leap here. But what he says is that the social machine of axiomatics is neither an automaton nor a cybernetic machine capable of self-regulation, because it must follow the variations in the movements of capital and relations of power that never tend to equilibrium. So in that way, it's not autopoietic. So he's taking from cybernetic theory via Varela, and I think he just quotes Varela, but this is also thinking about Maturana here. I think that's how you pronounce it. And the theory of autopoiesis. So what autopoiesis essentially suggests is that you can have a system that is self-regulatory, and that it is self-producing in a sense. Now that stands aside from allopoiesis, that determines other things outside of itself, and take a system not only relies on those other things, but contributes to their development as well, where you have a sort of like a social situation going on in that way. So we very much represent the latter, at least I think according to Lazzarato. So this is a pretty historical idea going back to Plato, where you have a social formation, whether it be in the form of any given state or anything like that, comes to mimic or resemble actual kind of identity types. We see that happening here in a sense, where people are placed under the same regulatory gaze as the system itself, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but I am making a little bit of a leap. He doesn't make that totally explicit, but he says that, in at least kind of against Foucault here, the distinction between disciplinary and security societies is quite useful as long as we remember that both are above all societies of capital, and that governmentality changes depending on whether control over the economic cycle is exercised by industrial capital or finance capital. So in that way, the thing that remains consistent, and the thing that mandates or regulates this system, is that mode of capital, right? So he always brings it back to that, where people nor the system itself are capable of emancipating themselves from it, which is really, him leveling his critique against Foucault for not considering wholly the effects of capital on this development of subjectivity, which I don't agree with at all. I am much more on the side of Foucault here, but it's still interesting. But he takes it further as to say that even Foucault's concept of biopower is only determined by the axiomatics of capital, where biopower, at least we might understand it via Foucault, that it is the idea that, make, live, and let die, in a sense, or how there's the shift on managing life as opposed to death. All of this, at least for Lazzarato, can be reduced to its relation to capital, where he qualifies that statement, make, live, and let die, with this: if you can pay, you can live, and if you cannot pay, you can die. I'm not so sure about that, and it's difficult to say because it depends on which kind of system you find yourself in. But throughout this book, he's talking about the kind of oppressive quality of the welfare state, rendering people, I guess, incapable of taking care of themselves or being autonomous beings. So if we keep that in mind, it would seem as though, if we take two examples like the United States and Canada to be really cliche about it, it would seem as though this doesn't necessarily apply to the same extent in both situations. Whereas in the United States, I'd be much more prepared to accept his thesis here that if you can pay, you can live, and if you cannot pay, you can die. Like, healthcare is ridiculous there. Whereas in Canada, it would seem as though there is much more of an emphasis on allowing people to live, which I'm not saying right off the bat is like a good thing. Of course it's a good thing, but that we have to question, at least through Foucault, how this maintenance of life can be an oppressive framework. But it seems kind of reductive how he's laying it out here. But again, this is something I'd be curious as to what other people might think about that. But here we have it. So from here, we'll move into the 5th chapter, titled Critique of Governmentality 3, Who Governs Whom, What, and How. And he begins with a quote by Deleuze from Negotiations, where Deleuze says that the key thing may be to create vacuoles of non-communication, circuit breakers, so we can elude control. An interesting kind of pragmatics, and it lays the foundation for what he's going to do here. So thinking about who governs why and what and how, he says that in contemporary capitalism, or that financial form of it, one governs social machines, and in brackets axiomatics, and subjectivities for these machines, in brackets the realization of axiomatics. So there's that dual configuration going on here, where whoever's in control, or the one who governs, whatever that might look like, not only determines those axiomatics, but the subjectivity or the realization of such axiomatics, where they determine what is acceptable as far as the domain of kind of the new, right? Where what things are allowed to come into being is determined. And this comes down to subjectivity more generally, where he says that by producing us as individuated subjects, social subjection assigns us an identity, a gender, a profession, a nationality, and so on. Now this makes me want to pull out my hair when I read something like this, because this is what Foucault is responding to, not directly to Lazzarato, but in the History of Sexuality, Volume 2 and 3. So in the first one, he's doing something similar to what Lazzarato here is doing, but in relation to sexuality, whereas in the second and third volume, he's rethinking his idea that subjectivity sort of developed in like the 19th, 18th, or 17th centuries, and thinks about how there are examples of this sort of subjectivity emerge, or how they've emerged much earlier than that. So he looks at Plato and Aristotle, and especially Aristotle, where there is an emphasis on a sort of self-austerity, or a sort of self-control, and how that can lead to virtue. So for Foucault, I think that if Foucault were to read this, and I'm bringing up Foucault a lot because that's what one of the central texts that or thinkers that Lazzarato was referring to, if Foucault were to read this, he'd say, yeah, you could find examples of nearly identical things occurring in the pre-capitalist era all over the place. So who's to say that that didn't represent some form of subjectivity, and this does? And it's an interesting claim, and I have trouble with this text for that very reason, but here, I'll keep going. So the oppressive, tendency of this system is to construct people in some way. So they are emphasis placed on this idea of being constructed, where capitalism constructs an enslavement in which humans act in the same way as mechanical parts, constituting human components and elements of mechanism, machines. So as I stated a little earlier, machines are those kind of homogeneous one-trick pony type things, but I find this difficult to reconcile with the rest of his project because it would seem as though that would be something that opposes the deterritorialized flows of becoming that humans could take on, that would simply mirror those same oppressive tendencies of advanced capital, at least in the way that he sees them as being oppressive. So I'm not sure how in his describing a sort of crystallization or a solidification of humans is part of that same system. It seems like a leap, like almost a digression. But there we have it. I think he would do much better, actually, if you were to recognize subjectivity in different forms, like in different times, different ages, and really point out why this form of subjectivity is different or why it represents something more oppressive. Because he sort of avoids that, and he says, yeah, it corresponds to some kind of machinic enslavement, but I think that the same argument can be applied to different sort of forms of state apparatuses. Whereas, even for Deleuze and Guattari, this phenomenon goes much earlier, much further back than capital, where the state was something through these apparatuses of control that grabbed people, like with these tentacles, and brought them in, and or apparatuses of capture. So I'd be curious, and he's not totally clear in how it differs, but yeah. But what he does make clear, and this is, I totally agree with this, all problems with the state, at least in contemporarily in relation to financial capital or finance capital, reduces all problems to the individual, right? So if it's not the individual, then it's individual groups, right? So, it's poor people, or it's any minority type figure that are the problem. But not only that, people come to, because they've been disciplined in such a way, internalize those beliefs and then believe that of themselves. Because as we know, and we must make clear that these disciplinary efforts don't necessarily manifest themselves in corporal ways, right? And that is Foucault's thesis as well. We move from punishing the body to punishing like the mind in a sense, or punishing people and the brain. And when we see that effectively occurring people at the level of signification, where people don't necessarily experience the discipline in a physical manner where they can easily locate the source of it, but rather it comes to them in the form, because it's in the form of signification, that it has a deeper effect or a more pervasive effect. So as he says about this, asignifying semiotics like money might put in place sign systems that have a signifying effect, but their specific function does not involve signification. And how I understand this, because it's tricky, by saying that their specific function does not involve signification, in that it can have supposedly real effects on bodies, on people, on cultures, on civilizations, on what have you, that make them real, in a sense. But asignifying, that term that he uses here, is defined by Guattari as being modes like music or clothing or the body, behavior, things that don't necessarily exist in nature, but don't necessarily exist in signification as well, because you can see it, you can kind of touch it, you can react to it. So they're asignifying in that they're signs of recognition and to all kinds of machinic systems. Yeah, it's a complicated idea. I'm gonna put that on the back burner for now, because it's a tricky one, and I'm not too familiar with Guattari on his own, so that I'll play the humility card here. So subjects themselves, at least in relation to their bodies, undergo something of an adoption, where they are told they have bodies, they are told they are individuals because of X, Y, and Z, and for that reason they can then be better manipulated and better controlled. because they've been also rendered, another key term is dividual. So this stands in opposition to individual, where individual might literally mean undividable. So you're a singular full entity, whereas dividual means that you can be divided, right? So that dividual body corresponds to this financial system because it has more of an affinity with the possibility of becoming, of deterritorialization, of moving beyond, of circumventing, and all that. So what essentially occurs here is convincing people of their autonomy in specific ways by saying they have a specific body that's unique to themselves, or in Deleuze and Guattari from A Thousand Plateaus, one of the signifying factors in that moment is the being designated with a face, or what the face is. So for Lazzarato, coming out of Guattari's idea of the body as being something you aren't born with a body, he says that one of the major initiatory phases of capitalist flows consists in the interiorization of the natural body, of the individuated body, already structured according to the dualisms of masculine and feminine, soul and body, individual and collective. Now, this is an idea that I really agree with, and I really disagree with, because I don't think that this is necessarily a product of capitalism, but has its roots far back in the Enlightenment thinking and rationalist discourse coming out of, whatever school you can throw in there. But how there was that move in the Enlightenment, and even before, you can find examples of this, where there was an emphasis on finding like the true nature of the human body. What did it mean? What did it look like? Let's cut open some bodies and figure out what's going on underneath. That all participated to this. And for me, this is a symptom of the broader cultural logic of scientific rationality that saw the need to kind of absolve the world of mystery, of anything like that, in favor of an omnipresent, supposedly neutral, universal scientific gaze. So he uses this point in thinking about the development of like this discourse around the body, or around individuation or dividuation through individuation. It's kind of, and that discussion is a little bit complicated, and I deliberately skipped it. But he makes the interesting case that there is something that exists underneath all the kind of superficial manifestations of a supposed oppression. So one of the ways that we think about this would be in terms of either, in the way that he presents it, technophiles and technophobes, where you either have people that are like, that take technology, or to take these possibilities of cybernetic possibilities as being either something to applaud, something to try and attain, or something to fear because of its possible apocalyptic ramifications. Speaking of, Paul Virilio died. For anyone listening, Paul Virilio is dead. It's too bad. So yeah, sorry, I digress. But of this phenomenon, he says that intelligence, technology, and science have not failed us. The creation of new possibilities and desires has. So this is the thing that undercuts all those other phenomena, like intelligence, technology, what have you. And I think that he is really on point about this element here, because you can see that everywhere, right? People, that's why people love watching Black Mirror, right? They want to be able to localize these problems in very specific ways, in ways that doesn't actually implicate them, but it implicates the technology, it implicates the machines, it implicates, a very singular and a very discernible and obvious zone, which is, a strategy we employ to absolve ourselves of guilt or anything like that. But it's and he goes on to say here that utopians and doomsayers, the technophobes and technophiles, neglect the fact that the man-machine relation is always bound to a social machine, to a capitalist axiomatics or war machine, in other words, to a politics of possibility and impossibility. And you get the war machine thing. He's a very selective reader, this guy, especially of Deleuze and Guattari, but that case is interesting, that these technologies, are a thing that come out above, or they come out as a result of the social machine. So really our gaze should be fixed on that, as opposed to these kind of superficial modes of communication or technology. So from this point, we'll jump into the last chapter here before the conclusion, we're titled Rereading Lenin. So how are we going to get Lenin out of this? What is useful from Lenin? So he starts out by saying, or asking, can we separate the real economy from the virtual economy, industrial and commercial capital from finance capital? Is it possible to conceive of the economic cycle of capital as a passage from material accumulation to financial accumulation? And I think that this idea, because of my own interest, and for anyone that's followed this channel a bit, especially in relation to Baudrillard, this split between the real and the virtual is a very interesting thing for me. And he has those moments when he's saying that, money can be on the plane of the real or the, the significatory. Whereas for me, that's, money is always in the domain of signification. Like, money only exists through a kind of social agreement of that thing, whatever it is, capital or diamonds or whatever, having meaning. So, but just thought I'd start with that. So as he recognizes in Lenin, at least as he says, Lenin sort of anticipated and foresaw finance capital as the endpoint of industrial capital, or of capitalism itself. Or specifically, as he says, it completes the cycle of capital. So in quoting Lenin, who says that the characteristic feature of imperialism is not industrial by finance capital, I think he's really chiming into something interesting here, at least Lenin is, about how industrial capital kind of has an affinity with the land in which it finds itself. So it is territorial in some way. And how it is finance capital that sees the deterritorialized possibility of capital being realized, that we can see imperialism really take off. So I think that he was, and I wasn't really familiar with Lenin before this, but Lenin was, he had some good ideas. It's interesting. But where Lenin gets it wrong, at least according to Lazzarato, is that, or at least one of the weak points, is that Lenin believes that the stock market will vanish with the disappearance of free competition and the establishment of monopolies, whereas that's clearly not the case. And then he quotes Keynes and Hilferding, who I'm not so familiar with and I'm avoiding bringing up because that's a whole other discussion, and it's really just supplementary evidence that would detract a bit from what I'm trying to get at here. But he then returns to this idea of the split between the reality of money and the concept of money. So, as he says, in Marx's time, finance was still at its very first stage of development, and his analyses could only be based on the concept rather than the reality, even if his New York Tribune articles from the 1850s show that he foresaw the power of finance. So Lazzarato's engaging in an activity that seems like everyone does at some point in justifying Marx, or trying to justify Marx's inability to foresee this development by saying that, in fact, he did see it. But I'm really interested, and I'm going to keep bringing this up. What is the difference between the concept of money and the reality of money? Because it would seem as though those two things really mold together, where it becomes difficult to discern whatever real effects money has as not being predicated precisely on its on the idea of money itself, or on the concept of it. And even anything that comes about due to it, does it have more of an effect? Does it have more of an impact in the quote-unquote real world, or in the concept of money itself, and that can then work as a sort of social significatory capital to keep money going, or the idea of it going? So, and then like Marx, Lenin also failed to recognize kind of the development of the culture industry, or the consumer society. So no less than the rest of the Marxist tradition, Lenin fails to foresee the integration of the working class and the population into the capitalist economy through increases in wages and incomes, right? So that how Ford was able to make the cars, like, they were affordable to the workers. Now, rather jarringly, I'll just move now into the last chapter, the conclusion, because the Lenin discussion is repetitive. He makes a lot of the same claims with different evidence and kind of goes around it. This is at least in my experience, pretty indicative of books toward the end. A restating of many of the central theses and observations in different ways is, the way to go about doing it. And the last chapter, the conclusion, deals with the refusal of work, or the case for laziness in a sense. So he's coming out of our Casimir Malvik's The Right to be Lazy, of which Lazzarato says that laziness, the real truth of mankind, or in this book, he denounces socialism, which seeks to ensure that all of humanity follows a single laborious path and that no inactive person remains. This is true of the actual program of today's ultra-liberal European Commission. Malvik, writing during the first years of the Russian Revolution, believes that labor leads to laziness, whereas if we start with labor, we always end up with labor, or worse still, employment. So it's not as though we should see some kind of ultimate beneficial end to labor, where one possible argument might go as follows: if we just allocate our resources in a proper way and allocate our working hours in a proper way, we can attain basic universal needs for everyone. Like, that would be simply ridiculous, I think, for Lazzarato here, because as he says, we must not take labor, whatever it may be, as our starting point, but always the refusal of work. And that we do not need to accelerate, but to slow down. So it demands that we reframe our relationship to this thing called labor and the absolute need that is imposed upon us, or that it is ingrained into us, that we have of labor, that we have of capital or capitalism. And then he ends his book here by stating that the need to discover, produce, and reconstitute temporalities, heterogeneous subjectivities and their institutions, requires that we continually seek to elude the techniques of subjection and enslavement deployed by governmentality, or at least that governmentality made apparent by finance capital. So I guess that'll bring us to the end here a little bit. It's a neat book. It's hard, and I think it's needlessly difficult, because he's using all these terms that are, come from other thinkers. He doesn't always define them, and he seems to conflate some with others, and it seems a little bit loose with some of his terms, and he's not always that consistent with like axiomatics or with his idea about deterritorialization, because at one point, deterritorialization is something to fear, but then at another point, what we are seeing is this kind of homogenization and reduction of people to single functions. So it's difficult to kind of trace a single thread or a linear scheme through it, but it is interesting. I'm happy I got to read it. But yeah, if anyone knows more about this than I do, which I guarantee most of you do, definitely tell me where I went wrong, or what things I omitted that would have been important or would have clarified things. But yeah, for now, take care everyone. Hope all is well. Have a good one.